I'm Nick Westergaard, and this is On Brand, helping you tell your story. My guest this week is Paulo Ribeiro.
Two things is the art of combining two unexpected things in an interesting way. And so that art of combining two unexpected things comes to life in our strategy. You know, the best strategies are built on tensions between, things that are unresolved, but also in the output of our work. So we believe that, actions speak louder than words.
Paulo Ribeiro is founder of Two Things, a transformative agency for active lifestyle brands. With clients like The North Face, Timberland, and more, Paulo's expertise in brand advertising and global brand strategy have shaped industry leaders like Nike and Electronic Arts. Paulo's innovative thinking and impressive portfolio, including Venmo and Twitter, have earned him recognition in publications like the New York Times and Fast Company. My interview with Paulo Ribeiro is coming right up. But first,
B2B marketers, get ready. The world's leading B2B marketing expo is returning to the Los Angeles Convention Center September 20th and 21st. This is the world's leading event for marketing solutions and innovation, and tickets are free. Join thousands of marketing professionals just like you to learn from over 100 industry expert speakers, educational masterclasses, and over 150 exhibitors. Hear keynotes from Amazon Music, Google, Netflix, Twitch, and Uber. It's September 20th and 21st at the Los Angeles Convention Center. Free tickets. Go to bit.ly/MPNB2B to register. That's bit.ly, bit.ly/MPNB2B. The Marketing Podcast Network is a proud partner of the B2B Marketing Expo for 2023. We'll see you in LA. You may know you're listening to this show along the Marketing Podcast Network, but did you know there are other great shows on MPN to help your business? Carrie Barrett hosts a great podcast called The VIQ Project. Carrie, tell us what these fine folks will get out of listening.
Okay, you know how you go to shoot a 2-minute video, except it takes 2 hours, you hate yourself on camera, you don't know what to do with it, and so it doesn't perform? You'll get all the tips and tricks you need to fix all of that on this podcast.
Wow, we're going to be lining up for this. Where can people subscribe?
You can find it on my website, which is carriebarrett.com. You can also find it if you search the VIQ Project Podcast on YouTube. Of course, you can find the show at marketingpodcasts.net, or you can subscribe and search for the VIQ Project Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
You heard her. Go subscribe.
Paulo Ribeiro, welcome to On Brand.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
So you talk about, being an agency for lifestyle brands, and I feel like that's one of those categories that we say a lot, but I feel like it's growing, changing, a moving target. How do you, as an agency leader, define lifestyle brands today?
Yeah. The agency's been around for 5 years, and actually we didn't only focus on that segment when we started, but over the past few years, it's become a focus both by design and out of just sort of, inertia in the way we've been going. In answer to your question about how do we define them, any brand that encourages physical movement, sport, and exploring the world. And that we've got 3 sort of core categories within that. There's brands that make sporting equipment. There's brands that make apparel and footwear. And then there's brands that are, focus on travel. So for instance, Sun Valley's destination marketing organization focuses on active travel in summer and winter. They're a client. What we found about that grouping of companies is they all tend to target a very similar consumer, that in terms of lifestyle habits, the type of content, regardless of the category that they're in.
That's interesting too, and shame on me because I left the word off too of you qualifying that of active lifestyle brands, because that answers a big part of the question too. Versus, I'm thinking if you don't define it, adding some sort of qualifier in front of that, then you've got lifestyle brands like the Pioneer Woman and other things that are promoting lifestyle in general. But when you talk about active athletics, and I love the combination of travel there too, because that's an interesting group to look at that, like you said, had a lot of similarities to it. And that exercise as an agency leader, I've talked about it before here, can be challenging in how to define that focus. It could be easy to say, okay, just the athletic, but how did you find that kind of interesting and that you just talked about with athletics and travel?
Yeah, and some of it is by exploration. So if I zoom out a bit, my career has had two sort of great concentration of client types: technology firms like Venmo, LinkedIn, et cetera, and then sports brands. Nike, I was head of brand strategy for Nike globally. Our clients at two things have included Converse, Timberland, Arc'teryx, the North Face. So in answer to your question, some of it is we are all victims and beneficiaries of sort of the network effects of sort of the places we've worked and the people that we know. But over time, that sort of experience in certain areas starts to build real expertise. So for us, yes, many agencies are generalists and work in a variety of categories. What we've found is we're pulled towards, certain types of brands and the joy of working with them. And what we learn from one client, we can help apply to another. And I don't mean sort of like trading industry secrets. I just mean there are certain dynamics and difficulties that brands that compete against one another sort of commonly face.
That's such a good point too about the things that you can kind of connect between all of those. And yes, not trading secrets, an important distinction to make that help clients sleep better at night. The other thing I wanted to come back to that fascinates me about you is your agency's name. Now, you mentioned listening to the show, it doesn't take much for me to go down the rabbit hole of wanting to learn more about the labels that we put on things, but naming things, especially agencies, can be challenging. So talk about the two things. It invites the follow-up question: what are the two things?
Right. So one of the things, two things is the art of combining two unexpected things in an interesting way. We are an organization that focuses in the strategy of brand transformation. So when companies need to evolve how they do their marketing. And so that art of combining two unexpected things comes to life in our strategy. The best strategies are built on tensions between, things that are unresolved, but also in the output of our work. So we believe that, actions speak louder than words. How a brand behaves will have more impact and can change the stories that it will tell. And so that's why we call the company Two Things, but it's also, it continues to rear its head through the strategy process and the creative development process. And I think the brands that, are making the most impact in the world are wrestling with paradoxes and tensions and trying to show up in new contexts. There's a lot of news around AI and the metaverse recently. Those are two very clear and simple, straightforward examples of each brand should be asking themselves how they play in those arenas. Well, that means taking maybe something from the physical world and translating it to the digital world. And there's a tension in that. So that's a long answer to your question about where the name came from, but it really is the creative process.
Well, and that's such a good point in the creative process too, which is a big, vast conversation in and of itself. But I loved how you really kind of centered that around the tension, because I think that's an important thing for people to understand, because a lot of times that tension feels weird, and in kind of our linear sanding out the rough edges, one side of the brain, if this then that kind of logical pragmatism, which is good for a lot of things, but a lot of times we can end up sanding out those rough edges of interest that can help our brand stand for something, stand out at a time when it's harder than ever to do that. So how do you start that process of saving and protecting those points of interest?
Yeah. Let me give you a concrete example. A few years ago, we were just at the beginning. I think of, COVID, this is very sophomoric, but there's like two waves of COVID, right? But when we first were encountering sort of the lockdowns and the shutdowns around COVID, we got a call from the CMO, who was a former colleague of mine when he was at Nike and I was at Wieden & Kennedy, and he was CMO of North Face. And the challenge was, for the first time, they had developed their own proprietary technology platform called Vective. And the challenge was they had distributed it to a number of elite athletes. They had broken a lot of records called FKTs, like fastest known time on trails. Mm-hmm. And the way you would show off technology like that would be in person at the marquee races. And but they were all canceled. Total lockdown. And so you have this tension between, we have technology, we want to put it on people's feet and let them feel it, but no one can get together outside. That tension became the creative brief that centered a campaign and an activation in partnership with Strava for have people sort of exploring trails virtually all around the globe, which was called Further Together. But we use that tension of, I want to get this thing on people's feet, but I can't get together. And so what should we make to develop this entire program called Further Together? There was virtual races around the country. It ended up expanding globally, that allowed people to unlock trial of the footwear. And so there's, in every great piece of work that I've been a part of or that I've seen, there's this if this then that tension. We want to do X, we're blocked by Y, or we want to appear one way, but someone else has claimed that space. That space is what creative people relish. Yeah. And that drives innovation, right? When you have an unresolved tension, people have to come up with a different way of behaving. And the best work these days, you mentioned how hard it is to stand out. The best work these days stands out in format and in message.
You mentioned in there, one of the examples of, we want to claim this, but someone else already has. And a lot of times that's a real, that feels like a real, dead end to a journey. What are some of the ways that you can address a challenge like that?
Oh, that's a really good question. So, there's a tension in my career between sort of spending, half of it in Silicon Valley and half of it working with brands that, invest a tremendous amount in brand and are really established, Nike, Electronic Arts, et cetera. So that tension is, and I'm just going to call, the advertising industry has this hang up about, if an idea's been done, it's done, right? Whereas the technology sphere and Silicon Valley, if an idea has been done, it doesn't matter if you can do it better. And I think in that is something really interesting about how companies behave, and it starts to open up opportunity to do things in a different way. So if, we mentioned the metaverse. I hadn't actually thought about this before we started chatting, but just because your competitor has done an activation in the metaverse or in Roblox or in the gaming landscape, it doesn't mean you can't go enter that same space and do something that's appropriate for you. And I think that's the distinction between sort of, a storytelling first, approach, which is, I can't tell exactly the same story, and an innovation first approach. They're both valid starting points. When you mash them up together, things get really interesting. And I can give some examples there, unless you want to take, the conversation a different way.
No, feel free to.
Let's use, I mentioned Roblox. I have two daughters, 14 and 10. They both, the only thing that they actually agree on is when they're playing in Roblox together. Paris Hilton just launched an activation called Slivingland, which is essentially, a universe where you can buy houses and streets and brand them, et cetera. She's looking for partnerships, what have you. There is no blockage there that would prevent any other hotel brand from doing a different type of activation in that same space. In fact, it would be welcome to kind of compare and contrast. So I don't think first mover prevents, others in the same industry from trying the same thing.
On Brand will be right back after this.
As a person with a very deep voice, I'm hired all the time for advertising campaigns. But a deep voice doesn't sell B2B, and advertising on the wrong platform doesn't sell B2B either. That's why if you're a B2B marketer, you should use LinkedIn ads. LinkedIn has the targeting capabilities to help you reach the world's largest professional audience. That's right, over 70 million decision makers all in one place. All the big wigs, then medium wigs, also small wigs who are on the path to becoming big wigs. Okay, that's enough about wigs. LinkedIn ads allows you to focus on getting your B2B message to the right people. So, does that mean you should use ads on LinkedIn instead of hiring me, the man with the deepest voice in the world? Yes. Yes, it does. Get started today and see why LinkedIn is the place to be to be. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Go to linkedin.com/MPN to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/MPN. Terms and conditions apply.
B2B marketers, get ready. The world's leading B2B marketing expo is returning to the Los Angeles Convention Center September 20th and 21st. This is the world's leading event for marketing solutions and innovation, and tickets are free. Join thousands of marketing professionals just like you to learn from over 100 industry expert speakers, educational masterclasses, and over 150 exhibitors. Hear keynotes from Amazon Music, Google, Netflix, Twitch, and Uber. It's September 20th and 21st at the Los Angeles Convention Center. Free tickets. Go to bit.ly/MPNB2B to register. That's bit.ly, bit.ly/MPNB2B. The Marketing Podcast Network is a proud partner of the B2B Marketing Expo for 2023. We'll see you in LA.
Now, back to the show. So you've talked a lot about tension. And one thing that intrigues me is the kind of tension. At times, it seems in the backgrounds of your experience of that of the advertising industry and the Silicon Valley startup space, the very entrepreneurial, innovation focused. Are there other pieces that have emerged from that interesting push-pull in how it manifests your work?
Other tensions?
Yeah.
So at an earlier stage in my career, when I was running Wieden & Kennedy Lodge, which was an innovation business within the Wieden & Kennedy ecosystem, we worked a lot with Nike's Innovation Kitchen, their playground for sort of innovating, new ideas. And here's a really interesting tension. One of our key client partners, who was an experimenter and kind of a catalyst for new ideas, was constantly blocked. When you get to a certain scale, you start looking for billion-dollar ideas, but that's not where novelty comes from. You have to experiment and play. So one tension is when a brand gets really big and established, it only starts looking for enormous scaled opportunities. And that's when the thinking starts to slow down. So here's a concrete example. We developed a platform for designing footwear called Live Design. It was built it premiered at Fashion Week in 2017, I believe. Consumers would come in with and influencers with, a blank white pair of shoes and walk around a space and design footwear while it was on their feet, and then get that shoe in under an hour. Now, the cost of this thing was immense, and it didn't quite scale yet. But very quickly, that technology, we demonstrated how that could appear in virtual reality and then in gaming devices. Well, just this year, Nike announced this program called Dot Swoosh, a partnership with Electronic Arts that has an enormous install base. Here's a $1 billion idea, virtually designing shoes inside video games that you can also get manufactured. But the kernel of that idea began in things like Live Design in 2017. to circle this all the way back to your question is, there is a tension between scale and experimentation, and innovation takes time, but you have to give it room to experiment with things that you don't know if they can scale yet, but they are interesting. And so you have to be okay with that tension of like, I've got marketing needs this quarter, and I also have things that I want to experiment with to see where it takes the company over time. That is a very concrete tension that exists, I think, in organizations of any size.
Well, you mentioned giving things room, and that is not something that we're always super good at in either of those scenarios.
And I think that dynamic has really accelerated in the last few years. If you think about sort of the evolution of marketing over the last 20, 30 years, the internet was a big deal, right? It changed everything, made inventory for ad units kind of infinite on all sorts of devices. But think about how like we were wrestling with that evolution for like a decade or more, and then mobile, right?
Yeah.
Well, in the last 3 years, just think about how fast these cycles have gone. We went from metaverse being everyone focus on that. Facebook changes its name to focus on it, invest billions and billions of dollars annually, not even knowing where it'll go. But then 18 months later, it's all about the blockchain. Right. And then 12 months later, here we are. It's AI is going to transform everything. So this pace of acceleration and distraction, to your point, man, it's speeding up and speeding up and speeding up.
Yeah, giving things room is something that's a hard ask. But yet necessary to actually see that space between the scale and experimentation that you were talking about.
Yeah. Yep.
So one story I wanted to make sure that I got to is along the way, another one of your stops saw you working with Reid Hoffman on LinkedIn's positioning. Say more about that, because I think we look at these monolithic brands like you've talked about, like Nike, and we know so much about what they stand for, but we don't know how they got there. And we could see that with LinkedIn, a brand that has developed in that very ecosystem that you've been talking about.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. So it was a tremendous privilege to be working with that brand at that point. So to set the context, LinkedIn had launched a couple years prior. I don't know if you remember this. It was a very different platform than it is today. It would ask you to, enter all of your contacts as a growth hacking strategy. And sometimes if people didn't sort of adjust their settings well, they would sign up and just blast everyone in their contacts to join LinkedIn. Not a really positive brand experience, but actually to connect this to the tension conversation before, the tension between an engineering-led culture that says, let's grow at any cost,
right,
versus, hey, let's actually build a product that, everyone trusts and uses in every capacity. So we actually got hired. This is when I was at Red Scout, and we got hired on a pretty straight ahead brand positioning assignment. What became really clear in the initial discovery work were we had these tensions that, like the one I just described. And Reid Hoffman, as a really thoughtful entrepreneur, wanted to spend time with us. So we had a series of lunches that were scheduled about a week apart over a 5 to 6 week period. Myself and our head of brand strategy, Gabby Muse. And these lunches would be about an hour, and they'd end up being 4 hours. And at each milestone, he was asking us to share our findings. And one of the things that became really clear as the internet started to change work broadly was that people were needing to both find jobs in a different way, but also be better at their jobs in a different way. And it takes a visionary like a Reid Hoffman to sort of be responding to these ideas and bring to the table plenty of his own. But the biggest tension that we found was the disconnect between a transactional job hunting site and something that that workers were yearning for, which is how can I be better in my job? And so a strategy assignment very quickly became a UX assignment and a product exploration assignment around how can we, instead of just helping people in that short term, I need to find a new gig moment, but how can I be better at my job? Which created the opportunity for entire content streams, a whole bunch of innovation around benchmarking yourself within your industry, training tools and tips. And so the first thing we developed as a proof point of this strategy is changing the UX of the onboarding. Instead of sign up all your contacts and spam them, what is your industry? Where are you in your career? How can we help you as you go along? And, in the tech space, engagement is king, right? And in digital products. And this also helped in that regard. When you let go of grow at any cost and you start focusing on drive engagement that's deep and consistent over time, it changes the product itself. And so that was such a privilege to be there at that moment, to be asked to sort of reflect back to the company what we were seeing, and to have a client that was already thinking about some of these things and so responsive and able to act quickly to experiment and trial. That was a really fun moment.
Well, that was, again, it's kind of a fun trip down memory lane, because I do remember the accidental, do it wrong and you end up spamming everyone. And I
have one anecdote to add on this,
yeah.
which is just such a stark contrast of the tension between sort of growth at any cost and build a brand that is trusted. Not naming any names, we actually sat in a meeting where a senior exec was sharing the engagement rate on, I think it was emails, it could have been texts, and put up one where the subject, it must have been an email, subject headline had misspellings in it. And instead of having something like, a 40% open rate, had like an 80% open rate. And there was a 1 hour intellectual discussion of, we got so much engagement and referral from that of people forwarding that piece of content because it had mistakes in it. Should we do more of that? And that is an example of the tension between grow at any cost and who cares what kind of engagement versus trust and being a partner. And I think, growth is necessary, but so is longevity and engagement. And you have to wrestle with that tension to find the right spot for your brand.
I love it. And that was a great story that kind of reinforced a lot of the points that we've been talking about here during this conversation, from tension, from making space, and yeah. So the conversation has made me smile a lot. And Paulo, it is now time for me to ask you for a brand or two that have made you smile recently.
Well, I mentioned earlier in this podcast sort of what EA, one of my former clients, and Nike, one of my former clients, announced with Dot Swoosh, and I love that one because of the scale of it. But I mentioned earlier that I have two daughters. We saw Barbie as everyone in the world did almost. And I love the activation around Ken, the Malibu Dream House with Ken hosting it. And I'm going to just connect it back to what we talked about before. Actions speak louder than words. Do something different, and it changes the stories you'll tell. And that was true in that activation that was so thoughtfully curated. It was true in that example I mentioned earlier around, Paris Hilton in Roblox, launching a virtual community, the Nike and EA example. In all of them, there is a very clear thread. Take a different action that's appropriate for your brand, and the stories follow.
That is a great example, and I love the idea of actions speak louder than words, because we all want to be more than just Kenuff. I've got all the dad jokes myself. So at least
it wasn't me this time.
There we go. It was my kids rolling their eyes. But Paulo, where can folks go to learn more about who you are and what you do?
Our website is www.twothings.co. And there you can find sort of the company's work, contact info, etc. Yeah, I think that is the simplest and easiest way.
Awesome. Well, we will link up to that in our show notes, which folks can always find at onbrandpodcast.com. Paulo, thanks for being on brand with us.
Thank you, Nick. It was a pleasure to chat with you.
On Brand is part of the Marketing Podcast Network. If you like what you're hearing, if we've made you smile, you can always listen free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever your favorite platform may be. And please take a moment and rate and review the podcast to help others find the show. Until next week, I'm Nick Westergaard, and I'll see you on the internet.
This podcast is heard along the Marketing Podcast Network. For more great marketing podcasts, visit marketingpodcasts.net.